All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Fullerton, and I am the CEO of Fullerton Strategies, a digital marketing agency, and I am going to be your moderator for the next hour for our storytelling do's and don'ts event with two experts in the field. We have both Frank O'Brien and Maddie Nance with us today, who are going to be sharing their experiences with telling stories, the most effective ones, and the do's and don'ts for each. We'll be here for about an hour today, and we've got a preset number of questions we're going to go through, but if you want to ask any questions at all, please enter them into the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to both Frank and Maddie to introduce themselves, and Maddie, we're going to go with you first.
No.
Actually, Frank's going to go first.
Frank first. I'm sorry. Frank, go for it.
Don't worry. Hi, everybody. I'm Frank O'Brien. For better part of 4 decades, I was the founder and leader of O'Brien & Garrett, one of the leading direct marketing agencies in the progressive and democratic communities. I stopped the client-facing part of my career last year, and this year I launched O'Brien on Message, which features a weekly messaging memo for nonprofits, usually tied to current events. Just a quick note before we turn it over to Maddie. We're not thinking of this as a kind of storytelling 101 event. We know there are a lot of really smart, experienced communicators on this call. So what we're going to try to do is really talk about some of the things that separate good storytelling from really great storytelling. What are the things that can kind of really elevate us to another level? And by great, I mean both purposeful and persuasive. Make sure our stories are kind of serving the needs that we're trying to get them to serve, et cetera. So with that note, I'm going to turn it back to Maddie.
So I'm Maddie, and you probably noticed I've got a different accent, and not everyone can guess it because it's a bit of a mix. I'm Australian and a New Zealander. I'm married to an American, and I live in North Carolina. So get a little bit of every accent in there. But in a nutshell, so I'm a former fundraising director, and I'm now a copywriter. So I run a business called Kind Word with my husband, Jeremy, and we specialize in nonprofit communications. So working with organizations all around the world, I write copy, and I also teach fundraising copywriting through team workshops. I have a mini course. So I'm all in the world of nonprofit speak.
Great. Well, as you guys can see, we've got a wealth of experience here. And as Frank mentioned, we're going to really dive into this for folks. So we're going to start right now. And the first question is going to be, really just top level. Why storytelling, and what is so important about it?
So one thing that, Tim, I'd say about that is there's a great book. My favorite book on storytelling is a book by a woman named Lisa Cron. And the title of her book kind of says it all. The title of her book is Wired for Storytelling. And it's from a behavioral science perspective, where literally our brains react to stories in a different way than they react to facts and figures. Another quote that I love about storytelling is from an author named Nancy Harhut, who has a wonderful book published last year on the use of behavioral science in commercial marketing, but it's easily transferable to our world. And what she says about it is 7 very simple words. Stories evoke emotion, and emotion drives decisions. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what I'd say about why storytelling really matters. Mm-hmm. Maddie?
There's 2 things come to mind. One is, like you said, the connection with emotion, that we make decisions with our hearts. I think we like to think we think with our heads, but really our hearts win at the end of the day. And our hearts connect to stories. So that's really behind decision making, is telling a good story. And another thing that came to mind is around memory. So people remember stories better than they do facts. And as a little side note, this is how I remember people's names. If you just tell a little story in your head, so if you meet someone, it's like, oh, it's the same as so-and-so's neighbor, blah, blah, blah. Make up a mini story. Something about that just sets into your brain and it stays there.
Yeah, and I'll just add real briefly here. I saw a great line, and Frank and I have both done a lot of work in the political space. And I saw somebody mentioning today, talking about the presidential, that the best campaigns, they campaign in poetry, and then they govern in prose. And I think it's another good example of the storytelling elements here. That it's all about storytelling rather than diving into the details necessarily of a fact or things like that.
Yes.
Okay. Maddie, sorry, do you want to add something to that, or?
I just said yes, I agree.
Okay, cool. Well, we're going to move to the second part of this, which is, you both talk a lot about the importance of emotion in storytelling. What are some do's and don'ts around using emotion when trying to convey a story?
Well, Frank, you've got a good one about leading with.
Yeah. I think it's always important to lead with emotion and fill back in with facts and figures, not to do the reverse. There's a Maya Angelou quote that I really love, which is people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of why emotion matters. But I think the trick to me is, we all know you're supposed to lead with emotion. The trick is really finding the right emotion that matches the moment and the messenger. We'll talk a little bit about that more later.
Mm-hmm. And it's not to say don't use fact, because there are a lot of situations where you do need that, particularly things like putting together a proposal for a major gift. They want to see the facts, but it's about which one comes first. So lead with emotion and back it up with fact.
Well, I'm gonna ask a follow-up for you guys on this. Is there a point in which there could be too much emotion in storytelling, and how do you find the right balance for your audience?
Say that again, Tim.
Sure. I was just saying, can there be too much emotion in your storytelling? And if you can, how do we strike the right balance of getting the right emotional tone rather than kind of over-indexing on it?
Yeah, so it matters by both situation and by audience. One of the things that's true is as you kind of move up the scale of donors, and you get to major donors and mid-level donors, the balance between facts and figures and emotion kind of changed. Not that they're not all motivated by emotion, but when I'm making a $1,000 gift, I might need a little more information than when I'm making a $25 gift. So I think that's one place where the balance matters.
Right.
I was talking to someone yesterday, and I think she's on this call, and we were talking about grant applications because they tend to be very fact focused, very corporate internal jargon, program talk. And I think people just do that in grant applications and they forget to inject some emotion there. So I think even in something like that, where I'd put that up there with the major donor proposal type things, where yes, you've got to have more facts in there, but you cannot forget about the emotional. So can you bring that in, for example, talking about what phrases like economic mobility or capacity building, use words that people would say in a conversation. So learning skills, having the ability to pay for things without the stress of how are you going to pay for tomorrow's meal, those sorts of things. I think even in grant applications and those more technical pieces, you can still use emotion, because at the end of the day, as a person reading it on the other side, and that person's probably read a pile of other applications with boring program talk, and it's going to be a breath of fresh air to read something emotional.
Yeah, and Tim, one of the other kind of do's on the use of emotion is do use the elements of surprise. Surprise might be the emotion that we use least often in our nonprofit storytelling, but actually one of the more powerful, most powerful ones. I always use this little equation, which is a good story plus surprise equals a great story. And the element of surprise really matters. And the element of surprise is also kind of expressed in another way. Someone asked Neil Gaiman once what he would put on the wall of a library if he could just inscribe something on the library wall. And he said, I would put, and then what happened? Just kind of the next storytelling. And then he went on to say, if I'm telling a story, that's what I want to hear. I want to know that people don't know what's coming next and are anxious to hear what's coming next. So that kind of surprise and that kind of unpredictability are big parts of making the emotion that you're trying to extract not be sort of rote.
Yeah, I like that. Can I add one more thing on this while we're speaking of emotion? One thing that I will say about it, one of our do's and don'ts, is do know what your reader can handle. I think in the nonprofit space, we deal with quite confronting themes, and I think sometimes we can get used to that. We can get used to talking about really heavy subjects, and we forget that people on the other end of the letter or the email, that's a lot for them to read while they're drinking their morning coffee. So I think, yes, go hard with the emotion, but know how much your reader can handle, because if it becomes too much, they'll stop reading it, they'll turn away. Or it's, like if it's a TV commercial and it's just too much, too sad, they'll change channels. So know at what point to ease it. But then the don't to that is don't play it too safe. So it's going to be different for every organization, obviously, but just have that in mind. How much can my reader handle emotionally?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a sliding scale, right? And I think the beauty of a lot of this stuff, it's also measurable. So there's a lot of trial and error in going through this as well. So no one's, go ahead, Frank.
Just a note, Frank Velasquez just posted an interesting comment on this conversation about the place where use of emotion can turn into manipulation. We always want to be careful. We'll talk in a minute, I think, about ethical storytelling a little bit, but one of the things that's important when you're sort of telling a story and using emotion is to not go over the top, not to be so sensationalizing. That's actually, it's usually wrong to do ethically, but it's also usually not productive to do. I always tell people when they're telling stories, never forget the power of understatement, the power of sort of saying something plainly that still evokes kind of emotion, as opposed to overwrought kind of dramatic language that doesn't always kind of fit the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, let's step back for a second. And actually, before I get to the next question, I just want to make sure for the people on the line, which we've got a good crew here, that if you have questions or comments like Frank had, Frank Velasquez on the call, not Frank O'Brien, please drop them in the chat. We'd like this to be an interactive session, which it's already started to be, which is great. So if you have questions or want to add into something that either of the speakers are talking about, please drop it in the chat over here on the right-hand side. So now we're gonna move a little bit less to talking about the emotional appeal, but and a lot of people struggle with finding the right stories to tell. And before you can tell a story, you got to find it. Mm-hmm. So what advice do you guys have for people searching out the most compelling stories to tell, which is probably the most important part of the storytelling aspect, right? Is actually finding something that is interesting and appealing to your audience.
You want to go first, Frank?
Sure. It's interesting because I worked over the course of my career with a lot of international development groups, Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, UNHCR, and a lot of them have story banks, basically, databases where they kind of collect stories and have a kind of so because they have a reservoir of stories, then when you are about to do an appeal, you can kind of search and sort of find a story that kind of matches the moment, that matches the situation. It's really, really useful to do that, to collect stories and kind of in the abstract, not just situationally every time you're trying to write an email or a grant proposal or a direct mail letter. The other thing I would sort of say when I'm looking for a story is I always look for images. A lot of our clients used to always sort of say, we wouldn't use a story unless we also had images that kind of matched the story and that conveyed the story, because visual storytelling is such a huge part of storytelling. Mm-hmm. So wait a minute, that person is not making eye contact with the camera. Can we find another photo? That kind of photography becomes really, really important. The other thing I was going to say is it's important to tell. A lot of organizations have different names for them, but basically story finders. They have comm staff who kind of actually go out and search for stories. It's really important to tell those people really precisely what you're looking for. But as you mentioned earlier, one of the big things, and I wonder, Maddie, if you could address it a little bit, is the importance of ethical storytelling when we're searching out these stories.
One thing I'll add to the story finding thing that connects to this is I think I've worked as a development director before, and I've been at organizations before where there's a bit of a divide between like head office and the people on the field, the program staff. And an example comes to mind. I worked for an animal welfare organization, and there wasn't a lot of talk between the head office staff and the staff actually at the animal shelters caring for the cats and dogs. And so one thing that helped, instead of just relying on the managers, so the shelter managers to get the stories for you, they're busy and they're doing so many other things. They're actually not on the front line. And I found it super helpful when I actually, with their permission, went straight to someone on the front line. And actually, I mean, we call them story champions. Like, get a story champion, and it might be someone who's the person who walks the dogs in the morning, that sort of thing. And they actually, well, I found this, they love to do when you ask them, can you tell us about the animals you're helping? Can you tell us about the people you're helping? These are the people who are actually doing the things every day. And so I found that if I had a connection with them and gave them a responsibility to tell me about the best stories they're coming across, they really would do it. And that's been a real barrier breakdown for me for communications. That the ethical thing as well, I think that helps there. If you don't want to be too far removed from the story, and you end up doing this thing where you're talking about someone, talking at them, talking down to them, that's not what you want to do. You remember that this is, you got to remember somebody's dignity. And so my thing is, when I'm writing a story, when the person whose the story is about reads this, are they going to feel good about it? Are they going to feel like, yes, that is me, that is my experience, rather than just being talked about like some kind of project? So I think that if I keep that in mind, it really helps how I talk about someone, and using language that, that instead of talks down to someone, you can, for example, rather than focusing on weakness, I then shift it to the situation. So the situation they're facing is challenging. And then that turns into a strengths focus. How strong is this person to be able to deal with this unimaginable hardship?
Yeah, and I think obviously, the other elements of ethical storytelling, and besides what Maddie just said, I like the way you described that, Maddie. Is kind of approval and consent. Is the person aware that you're telling the story? Are they aware that you're using the story for the purpose that you're using it? And in the medium that you're using it. And are you presenting a kind of one-dimensional portrait of that person that's not authentic to who they really are? Helpless victim, for example, as opposed to someone who has a lot of agency in what they're doing, is applying a lot of courage to the way they make their way through life. So that kind of consideration is really important. I think more and more organizations are understanding when they search for stories that sort of those are some of the first requirements before you get to sort of what's compelling and persuasive.
So I want to dive into this with both of you, because Frank, you've given a large scale example of this with large organizations, and Maddie, you've kind of talked about some more local. And Frank, for those of you who don't know, I worked at Oxfam, and that's how I first met Frank. Frank worked with Oxfam a lot more than I did, and the storytelling element there was huge. And Frank mentioned photography, and Oxfam was one of the first organizations, anti-poverty organizations, that only used imagery that uplifted the people being, affected by poverty. This, in the 80s, there was a lot of making people, like, talking down or making people feel bad for them, and flies and that sort of stuff. So I kind of want to talk about guidelines here. So we know what makes a good story, and the people listening, a lot of them are probably copywriters and storytellers as well, but how do we give guidance? Like, Frank, a good example is the program staff on the ground in some of these countries, like who are gathering some of this for Oxfam, like how do you set up that structure so that you get what you need, and also the person being written about also feels good about it as well?
So I think in terms of ethical fundraising, often the people who are on the ground in the field are the most sensitive and aware of those facts. I almost feel like you don't have to tell them that. They kind of so aware to it. What I do have to tell them is find a story in which your organization actually has a role. A lot of people, when they go out and tell stories, they act kind of like a journalist trying to document the problem. Mm-hmm. So they go out and they kind of, here's a terrible story about the victims of this earthquake and what's happening to them and how displaced they are and how hard it's going to be to rebuild their lives. And then they stop there and don't kind of say, so here's what we're doing about it. Here's a story about it. Or they do this. They tell a really emotionally powerful story about the problem, and then they lapse into kind of program speak about the solution, So I'm really engaged with what's happening to these people and how they're fighting for it to regain the equilibrium in their lives, et cetera, et cetera. And then next thing I know, you're talking about a 5-point plan that kind of bores me to death. So finding the same emotion, finding the same kind of emotion to the thing that engages the organization and its work, and therefore engages the donor and their philanthropy is usually where people in the field sometimes fall flat, unless you kind of emphasize that's what you're looking for.
Can I also say that when sometimes it's about perspective. So you said it, Frank, sometimes we can slip into that mode of the organization talking about, here are all the great things we're doing. You can talk about those things, but keep the perspective from the person in the story. So instead of saying, the organization name offers this program, blah, 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 then say, Frank joined this program, blah, 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 and he's now doing this, or he was able to blah, blah, blah. Like, so you're talking about the program, but keep it from the perspective of the person in the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And Tasha on the chat mentioned too often fundraisers aren't making use of program staff and their zone of genius to gather stories. And I think there's definitely truth to that.
Yeah. And that can then, it's that us and them thing, like they can feel like, it's almost like why would you shut the people out who are on the ground doing these things? Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think that's totally right. But I also think it's totally right that you have to have some conversation. They have to understand your world as a fundraiser and communicator, as well as their world as kind of a program person who's implementing the programs, and try to kind of bring those two perspectives together in powerful stories.
And it's sometimes a challenge too, right, for programmatic people who are literally in the middle of a lot of times humanitarian disasters or other types of disasters, and then here come the fundraisers being like, and I've been in this situation, and I know Frank, you've been in this situation, like, and they're like, well, I don't have time for that. And how do you I mean, I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from you guys. Like, how do you massage those conversations too, where it's like, we really need understand that this is a horrible moment, but like, how do you sort of balance that with programmatic staff where it's like, this is important for you as well?
Well, I think, again, at least Tim, as you know, some of the larger organizations have kind of anticipated that problem. They now attach comms people to emergency response.
Yeah.
So that there is someone there who's trying to sort of make sure they're delivering the emergency aid that needs to be delivered, and honestly doesn't have a moment in the day to kind of start searching for stories for you. And then there's a comms person who's literally there to sort of try to kind of help play that role. I think that's usually a pretty effective way. I always feel awful when I'm talking to someone and it sounds like at the end of a 10 sleepless days, and I'm asking them, tell me a little bit more. But I think the comms piece is one way to the comms staffing is one way to kind of solve that.
Yeah.
The other thing as well, I know this is probably something we're going to talk about later, but having different perspectives in the story, the people we're talking about here, the people on the ground getting the stories, they can be in the story. So you can actually have the doctor, the social worker, they can be a voice in the story. So it's not just, hey, can you give me information about this? It's like, let me hear from you. How are you feeling doing this work? And I think that helps them, like Frank, what you were saying, when you start to feel like, oh, I'm bothering them, and they're like, I don't have time for this. It helps when they actually feel like an important part of the story themselves.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think that's true. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. So we've talked a lot about ideas and guidelines. Let's talk about writing the story. Now you found that great story and you got it from your amazing programmatic team. What are some of your do's and don'ts as you begin to put this together?
I'll give you one don't. Don't tell finished stories. Don't tell a story that is so complete that as a donor, all I can do is appreciate it, not really play a role in it. Tell a story that's kind of, there is a next step, there's a, and then what happened, and then what can I make happen element to it. And when you tell a finished story, you get sort of a pat on the head for doing good work. You don't get engagement from the donor. So that's one don't that I think is really important. And
I'm anticipating some people saying, but what if the person's already been helped? What if there is a happy ending to the story? So that's when what you can do is, that's when pace comes into it. Pace the story. So you can say all of these things, but it's about when you say it. So, for example, a lot of us organizations in Australia do 2-wave direct mail appeals. So wave 1 will be introducing the story. You're not giving an outcome at that point. So it's the story's 30% there. And then wave 2, you're bringing in the and what happened next. And then it doesn't end there. And then you might have follow-up emails, follow-up social media posts. So you're kind of letting a little bit of the story out with each communication, rather than feeling like I have to tell the entire story in every piece. So it's kind of like, it makes me think of that Humans of New York Facebook thing.
Yeah.
I love that because it's always like, post 1 of 2. And then I'm like, where's the next one? I want to see more. Just a little bit like that. So you're sharing the story, but you're wanting them to say and what happened next, and keep them along for the journey. So that might be more follow-up emails, follow-up social media posts. And then you could some organizations like to have the ending as part of the reminder things, and then the ask becomes, but there are still more children like this, right, who still need your help. And I have other clients who prefer to wait until the thank you to do that. So they keep it in the need when it's the ask. And then when somebody gives, and then it's saying, thanks to you and other supporters, this child is on the way to receiving cataract surgery, and we'll soon see those sorts of things. So you can pace it. It doesn't have to be, let's tell the whole story straight away.
Yeah, another do, Tim, on the writing of a letter is to choose the right narrator. We talked about this a little bit earlier, especially in the examples we were talking about of kind of international crises where there's kind of, something happening half a world away. I always hate it when I see a communication about that from the CEO back in the New York headquarters of the thing, as opposed to someone from the field. We call them from the field narrators, people who are kind of like Maddie was talking about earlier, hands-on and actually involved and engaged in doing it. That just brings the donor and the action take, whatever you're trying to get them to do, closer to the action and closer to the thing. But it's really interesting. One of the things, I worked for a long time with Doctors Without Borders, and one of the things we discovered, we went in to our first thing saying, we're going to tell some great stories about the people that you've helped. And then we'll get the donor and the people that you've helped closer together and feel more of a human connection. Then we did some focus group research, and we realized, actually, donors would rather hear the story from the point of view of a doctor than from the point of view of the person who had received the medical care, because for a couple of reasons. One is they could relate more easily somewhat to them. That could be my son or granddaughter, doing that kind of work. So there was that element of it. But they also just kind of, it brought them closer to the story, actually, not because they didn't care about the people who were getting the help, but because they just felt like they understood the story and understood their role in helping doctors. If it was told, the catchphrase we use, telling stories through the eyes of a doctor, So choosing the right narrator isn't always as obvious as it might seem.
You just made me think of an example of something that I get asked a lot, and it's people who are like, I just have nothing to work with here. So a lot of times, especially with international organizations, you might get something from the program staff that's like 2 lines of like, about this one person, or even a quote from the person themselves, the person who was helped. When not everyone's able to articulate it in the way that we want them to, so they might say, thanks to blah 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 for helping me, and it just might not be a whole lot to work with. But one thing you can do is when you bring in the voice of the person who helped them, so let's say it's the doctor, and you interview them, they might say things like, in the lead up to the surgery, this person told me she was feeling scared, but she was so excited to see the world again. Something like that. And and actually the person who was helped, there are amazing quotes there. They're just, when they're put on the spot, they're not going to say it like that to you. So you might have to get it through the person who helped. And so it's kind of this quote within a quote. And they say like, they told the doctor might be able to say, when they came out of the surgery, the first thing she said to me was this. And so that's where you get your powerful quote. And it's a bit easier to get that through the program staff, for a number of reasons. And a lot of times it's a language thing as well. If your first language isn't English, it's really hard to articulate something so complex and emotional.
Yeah, and Tim, another kind of do and don't in terms of when I'm sitting down or someone's sitting down trying to write a story-based appeal, is to, I always tell people, write like a storyteller, but don't write like a poet. People, and by that I mean, people can get writers, and sometimes you can get wrapped up in our ability to kind of use really poetic language and wonderful turns of phrase and really dramatic kind of expressions. And that usually doesn't work for a couple of reasons. The first reason is people receive the things that we send to them as personal communications, not as works of art. So if we write it like a work of art, we're actually creating distance between ourselves and the person receiving it instead of creating closeness. But the other is when you write poetically, sometimes you write, as we talked about earlier, in kind of an overwrought, sensationalized way, and that's usually letting the facts speak for themselves. So the details of a person's story speak for themselves can evoke the emotion a lot better than overwrought, sensationalized language. So storyteller, yes. Poet, no, is a good guideline.
It's about voice as well. You get the classic write like you talk thing. But I know when I write for clients, I know I've hit the mark when they say, I can hear the person saying this when you write it. Yeah. And often I'm writing in the voice of, I might be in the voice of a CEO who I don't know them, but being able to capture their voice is like, yes, I've done it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to just surface a comment that came in from Allie that's a little bit on this point is I think the agency of the story owner is a critical component. A story is a person with a problem and the steps they take to resolve it. The organization should feature as a partner in helping a person achieve their goals and dreams. And I think that is a point that you guys have both made. It's great to see somebody else.
That's incredibly well said.
Yeah. Can I say I love that term, story owner. Yeah. I'm going to steal that one because it's their story. You're not taking it from them. They're allowing us to tell it with them, not for them.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that is a very important, right? The with, not at or for, right? Like yes. Everything is a partnership in these things. So now we're gonna shift a little bit. You've written the most amazing story ever written, and now you have to get it approved. This could be, in some cases, very easy, and in some cases, incredibly difficult, especially in large organizations, for example. Do you have any tips to get your stories over the line without them being edited to death?
This. I feel like this is something that happens everywhere, and it's even when organizations hire a professional writer to write something. It's shocking how much that writer's work will be edited internally by random people who should have no business writing.
Yeah, but I think there are kind of ways to do it. Whenever I worked with a new client, one of the first things I would do is sort of ask, who are the people that are going to be involved in the copy approval process, and especially the program people. And I would sit down with the program people and I would ask them two questions. I'd say, what's the most irritating fundraising letter experience you've ever had? What really frustrates you when you're asked to review and either edit or approve copy? What goes wrong? And what is it that you think is most critically important for people to hear and know about your work? When you have that kind of conversation, first of all, you learn a lot. But second of all, you build trust, and you build sort of a much more trusting relationship. So I think that there is sometimes an incredible amount of tension between fundraising writers and program staff approvers. A lot of that tension is created by misinformation and a lack of groundwork on both sides of the equation. As a writer, I always tell you, leave your ego at the door. If you have an edit that is not consequential to the fundraising and communications power of the thing, leave it alone. It's only your ego at stake in that edit. If there's an edit that like frustrates the fundraising value of it really kind of makes the ask weaker, and then kind of fight back a little bit. But by fighting back, I usually mean something like this. I mean saying, hey, I see what you're after, but if we tried it this way, if we tried to get at it this way, would that work for you? As opposed to, no, we can't possibly do that stupid thing you asked me to do.
Yeah.
I just think that sort of finding kind of solutions, having, and having a little grace on both sides of the equation works. But I think forming those initial relationships and having a closer relationship to begin with can ease some of that tension.
So I agree with what you're saying in this example you gave when it's program staff. I'm more talking about people. Okay, so I worked for an organization once where we had to get every single board member's approval for something like a fundraising letter to go out. And the type of feedback, it would be like, oh, my wife reckons it's a bit repetitive. So I just went ahead and took out some of the ask. And it's like, no, that's repetitive for a reason. And from that, I learned that when you present copy, you have to put some kind of explanations in it so that people know there was a reason that it's written this way. And that's an example. I'll say something, I have a comment. You might notice that in this letter, we ask 3 or 4 times, just in different ways. That I've done that on purpose because people skim read or people need to hear something a number of times before they make a decision. So sometimes there's a bit of teaching involved with the presenting of your copy, and that then might help them not rewrite it.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Maddie. I hate it when I was running my agency, I would never let writers submit their copy with here's the draft, and an attachment.
Yeah.
We always tried to write not a massive missive about what we did, but some explanation of what we did. And like you said, anticipating places where you think people might have pushback, so you can kind of explain in advance why you did what you did. The other thing I think is really helpful is sort of for establishing some rules, if you can, establishing some rules at the start about what each person in the review process is supposed to be doing. You're supposed to check facts.
Mm-hmm.
You're not supposed to write. You're just checking facts. If I've got some facts wrong, let me know. And even if you are someone who's supposed to comment on sort of the language and the flow of the letter, it's always way more helpful to sort of say, here's what I see not working, as opposed to rewriting it. So asking people to kind of tell you what they'd like you to fix as a writer is way better than having them take an attempt at writing it and having you say, "Oh my God, I can't."
Love that idea. So you're saying instead of just giving it to someone and letting them just overall give their feedback, you're actually giving them a specific job. So
Right.
I would love you to make sure I've got all the facts right, or that I've talked about the program correctly. I don't know, something specific.
Yeah. And there are other people. It might be a person in the comms department who's looking at it for language uses, but a person in the program staff, maybe all you're asking them to do is check facts. So
Yep.
that if people have kind of clear understandings of their roles and what their expectations are, and what latitude they have to kind of react to it, that sometimes that's something else. But I do think, in all honesty, I think when that tension creates, we fundraisers and we writers are often as guilty as the people on the other side of that equation in terms of getting our backs up needlessly about things and not doing the preparatory work at the front end.
Yes. But I will also say this. I think it is important to take a moment to actually think about who is the part of this review process, because maybe, the example before, maybe it doesn't need to go to every board member. Maybe Gary in accounting doesn't need to give his feedback on. So I would encourage people to question that. Does this need to? Because it also it makes it too many people in the kitchen, too many cooks in the kitchen, and it also slows down a process where sometimes in fundraising a lot of times it's better to just get 80% and out the door because time you're on the clock.
Right.
I'll tell you my worst copy approval situation of all time. And Tim, you'll really appreciate this one. When Michael Dukakis was running for president, so we're going back in time. Michael Dukakis was running for president. I was the fundraising director, the development director for direct response at the Democratic National Committee. And we would write letters and we would have to wait until they were FedEx back from whatever airport he was at with his personal notes about edits he thought we should make. And I'm like, oh my God, you're running for president. This can't possibly be the best use of your time. Yeah. Just kind of this, how his staff insisted that process worked. So setting up the kind of some logical approval process at the start of an exercise might be really helpful.
Yes. Oh man. And I had another situation once, because I mentioned before, we're often writing in the voice of the CEO. And I remember at one of the organizations I worked at, the executive assistant to the CEO would rewrite it all and say that she did that because anything that has his name on it, I have to approve. And it was one of those tricky things where it's like, I know it's got his name on it, but fundraising needs to be, it can't be exactly his voice, how he would say it. And I think that's a tricky thing to achieve internally, to get someone to trust you, to speak in their voice in a slightly different way than they might say it.
Yeah. It's not always possible to do this, but I would tell you that the most successful relationships that I had when we were writing for organizations was when I had a personal relationship with the CEO who was writing it. So, when I was working with Anthony Romero at the ACLU or Cecile Richards at Planned Parenthood, we would literally sit down every quarter and just kind of talk. What's going on? What are you hearing? What's what are you worried about? And then you could get some sense and feel for how they express themselves. And you can, you can't always reflect, as Maddie said, you can't always reflect how they like to talk about it, but a lot of times you can and can be pretty authentic. So I know it's not always available, but if you can ever kind of convince folks to let you kind of have occasional exposure to the person who's signing most of what you're writing, that's unbelievably, I almost said invaluable, but then I remember that Maddie had a post yesterday about the use of that word. So I'll say it's incredibly valuable.
Let's stop saying invaluable because it sounds like a bad thing.
Yeah, right.
But I do have a tip for when those situations where you've got to write in the voice of someone else, but you need to add some differences in there. So let's say, for example, you are working with a CEO and he or she, they're just not very emotional. So they might speak in just very serious corporate language. So the part you got to bargain a bit. So you got to I'm going to add in more emotion. Are you okay if I say it this way? But what you can do is listen out for words, phrases they use, words they use, and sprinkle those in there. And so I often find that is enough to make them feel like it's their voice. And I'm talking specific things like, do they use, one of the CEOs I work with, one of his favorite words is terrific. So he says terrific a lot. So I just make sure I put a lot of those in there. Or, some of them like to, when they do get emotional, they'll say, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. So you listen out for those little things, the way that they speak, and you sprinkle those in there. And then you can add in more emotion or more of what you want to say there, but they still feel like they've got their identity in there.
Yeah. Maddie, I love that you say breaks my heart like you're from Boston.
This is what Frank and I talk about. We have from opposite sides of the world and we have different accents, but there's some words we say the same.
So one thing I want to kind of come back to is kind of a bigger picture about sort of when I've written something or when someone's written something, have we checked the boxes we need to check? And here are the 3 boxes that I always hope to check, which is first, I hope I'm telling a great story. So I've got a story that kind of works in a lot of the ways we've talked about. So I've got a good, solid story I'm telling. But so check, I got that. Second, have I connected it to the organization's narrative? Is it a story that's kind of just a great story, but it doesn't really sort of tell me a whole lot more about whatever organization I'm writing for. But so it has to have that connection. But the next connection, maybe the most critical one, is does it connect to the individual donor's personal narrative? Does it connect their own sense of this, their own identity? People give to express who they are as people, what they believe in, how committed they are to what they're acting on. But a lot of times we don't talk to them that way. We talk to them like, here's it's a little bit, Maddie, more like a grant application than like a personal request. And it's like, here's all the work that we're doing. And kind of at the end, hey, would you like to kind of support it? Kind of, sure, you're welcome on board to support it. What we should be doing is writing a letter that sort of really connects to their kind of personal identity. So I know as a person who loves animals, you're going to be outraged by what I'm about to tell you. Now, if I start my letter there, I've already kind of connected with their kind of identity. So those are the 3 check marks that I kind of, if you actually do those things, you have a great story, you've connected the organization narrative, and you've related it to the donor's personal identity, you almost can't lose. It's almost, to me, that's kind of if I had a litmus test for kind of what's effective, well-written, story-based message, those 3 things would be it.
I love that last one because one of the things that we say a lot in the fundraising circles is to always use you language. So it's always, instead of we do this, it's you. But I feel like what you said takes that even further, thinking about, well, who is you? Like, who are they? And by reminding them that they're actually part of something. So saying, as a fellow animal lover, I know your heart breaks as much as mine to hear this story. So something like that, it brings them in. Almost like I remember once hearing when I was on the phones talking to donors, I loved when I heard one supporter tell me once, it feels like I'm working for the organization too. Like it feels like I'm part of your team. And I thought it was really cool because it's almost like they feel like they're part of it. They're doing the work too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, we have 10 minutes left, so we're gonna. This is the last chance for questions, but we're saving the best question for last. So for everyone sticking around, thank you, and you're getting the best part now. What is, you've both written more stories than you can count. What's one for each of you that really has stood out over your career?
How do you want to go first?
You go, Frank.
Okay. So mine's actually an easy choice, although I'll tell you, I have a very close second, which is very recent. I love the way, and I'm going to write about this in my next coming Monday on Memo next week. I love the way that Kamala Harris relates the story of Amber Nicole Thurman, the 28-year-old woman who died because of a Trump abortion ban. And she just tells that story in such dramatic, emotional, fashion. It's really fascinating. But my all-time favorite, is the Doctors Without Borders story. And I'll tell you the capsule version of it. There's a doctor woken up in the middle of the night to rush back to the emergency room through pouring rain to operate on a woman who, if she doesn't have surgery immediately, will lose both her life and the life of her baby. So he jumps into gear, starts to kind of get ready. Just as he begins to make the first incision, the power and the lights go out. So now he is in pitch black darkness. And in the way this person tells the story, it's kind of interesting. It's counterintuitive for a doctor. He's like, he feels helpless. I always think of surgeons as being really together and always everything, but he talks about what a helpless feeling it was to sort of sit there and saying, oh my God, I have these two lives in front of me and I'm going to lose them. And there's nothing I can do until the anesthesiologist grabs a medical tool that they use. It has a light bulb attached to it and it holds it up and it gives him just a little bit of light. Then one of the nurses comes forward and takes your cell phone and puts your cell phone in place. Then other staff kind of woken from their nighttime sleep come, and he has 6 or 7 cell phones and that medical instrument lighting it up. He's able to do the surgery and he saves their lives. I just love that story. It's just so much. It's the power of surprise. Is what's at work there. It's just a wonderful story. And what was interesting about it, I helped shape it as a fundraising appeal when I worked with Doctors Without Borders, but no pride of authorship whatsoever. The doctor himself wrote an amazingly compelling blog about it. And I basically just put all of his words on the page and said, give money. But I just think it's a really powerful example. It does so many things.
Yeah.
It checks those 3 boxes because it's a great story, obviously. When he gets to the end, he does the other thing that connects it. He goes, I won't do the language justice, but he says something like, I always think of this story as kind of illustrative of what Doctors Without Borders is all about. We shine a light into the dark places in the world. Oh my God. Now he's like, totally. I'm like, I wish I had written that list. That's way at the top of my, I wish I had written that list. Because what he's done is he's very artfully connected the personal story he's told to the organization story. And then he goes to the next step and says, and as someone who reaches halfway around the world to help people's lives, that's the kind of change that you're making. So now he's got to connect personal identity. So to me, that story is a decade old. It's still being used by Doctors Without Borders. It's so powerful, but it's easily my favorite.
That's incredible.
So I'm going to take a bit of a different approach. I'll tell you what I was given and then how I made it into a story. So it's for an organization. They do work with communities in a very small island country called Timor-Leste. So I was given the fact that a 55-year-old grandmother had joined their reading program. So that was what I had to work with. So it was kind of like, that's nice, but there wasn't like a whole lot to work with there. And so here's what my thinking was to make it into a story. And so I thought, okay, so she's 55. Okay, so why is she in the reading program? Does that mean she never got to learn to read? And I found out she was not allowed to go to school. Only her brothers went to school. So girls in her family were not allowed to go to school. And so the story began, and I thought, okay, at 5 years, when she turned 5, she watched her brothers go off to school and she wasn't allowed to. And so then I was like, okay, she's 55 now. That means she's waited 50 years to be able to learn how to read. And that became the headline for the campaign. And it's then I used wording to tap into empathy. And the headline was, can you imagine, could you wait 50 years to learn to read? That was the headline. Wow. And so it was that's what I'm saying is how if you're not given much to work with, it's amazing how you can actually make a story out of it. And it's not, you're not making stuff up. These were facts. So it literally just took her age, worked out how long has she waited to go to school. And that's how it happened. And then it built on from there of like, okay, during those 50 years, what does that look like? So you create the before. before being able to learn to read. And she shared some of her quotes were about going to the market and people tricking her about how much things cost. So she was being taken advantage of. And then the after, using that example, she says, I now go and I don't have to ask someone what the sign says. I know they're not telling me the truth if they're saying it says something else. Things like that. It's like, oh man, I can relate to that. That's hard. But so that I was able to build such a beautiful story, and I found it so moving just imagining this woman's experience. But my encouragement to everyone listening is, if you don't get much to work with, just look for details in it. Look for some details that could become the actual, foundation of the story.
Awesome. That's a great story.
Yeah, I think those are both just incredible examples of powerful storytelling that sort of check all the boxes of what we've been talking about over the past hour. And with that, my friends, before we wrap, just letting you know it's in the chat, but a video recording of this will be sent around next week. There's also links in here to sign up for both Maddie and Frank's newsletters, which I highly encourage you to do. Also connect with them on LinkedIn because this is an ongoing conversation. It doesn't just stop today. So with that, I want to thank Maddie and Frank for taking the hour to give their expertise and knowledge to all of us. And I think this has been a super fun hour. And thank you all for joining us. And I'm sure.
And thank you, Tim, for moderating it so well.
Yes, thank you, Tim.
Oh, you're very welcome. So with that, we will say have a great rest of your day, everybody. And thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.
Take care, everybody.